Greetings, chess players! Today I'm going to introduce the loopholes hiding in the rule set of the Retrograde Chess Puzzles. If you don't know what Retrograde Chess Puzzle is, I recommend to check the previous videos first. Let's recall the rules first. For the castling, we assume that the castling is always possible unless proven impossible. And for en passant, we assume that en passant is impossible unless proven possible. Let me say why these rules are made. The most important reason is that you cannot simply bring the whole game history with the puzzle. That would be too annoying. So this rule set is designed to be as close as possible to the actual chess game without providing the actual game history. For example, let's think of the castling. There are two ways to reach the given position from the starting position. Since the castling is a very common move, if most of the game histories are possible, the retrograde chess puzzle generally assumes that the king or the rook have not moved, allowing the player to castle. If the player wants to say the castling is not possible, then the player must prove that there is no possible game history to reach this position without moving the king or the rook. If the player somehow prove it, then the retrograde chess puzzle cannot assume that the king or the rook have not moved, so now the castling is not allowed. En passant is quite opposite. Since en passant is a very rare chance, the retrograde chess puzzle assumes that the pawn didn't just move two squares. If the player wants to do the en passant, then the player must prove that there are no possible game history that allows the pawn not to move two squares right before the given position. If the player somehow prove it, then the retrograde chess puzzle cannot assume that the pawn didn't just move two squares, so now the en passant is allowed. So this was why this specific rule set is made. It seems they are plausible enough. The castling is allowed and en passant is not allowed. However, there can be some edge cases where these rules contradict with themselves somehow. For example, there could be some position that, if we assume the castling is possible, then en passant also becomes possible. And we assume en passant is impossible, then the castling also becomes impossible. Then this breaks the retrograde chess puzzle. Let's see how this works. This is the example of this rule contradiction. White to move, mate in 2. White to move means that black just have moved something. It could be a king, it could be a rook, or it could be a pawn. If black has moved either the king or the rook, that means black cannot castle. And if black has moved the pawn, it couldn't have come from g6 because that's a checking position. So if black has just moved the pawn, it has moved two squares, and white is allowed to do en passant. Since it is impossible to follow both of the rules at the same time, let's ignore the rules at this moment. Just assume that this is an actual chess game with an actual given history. And also let's assume that you actually know the history like a normal chess game. Let's examine all possibilities. First case, black just moved the king or the rook. Then you can move the king, knowing that black cannot castle. Black does anything they want, it's not important, and you push the rook and checkmate. Now the second case, black has moved the pawn. In this case, you can actually do an en passant without any problem. If black does something like this, you can easily score the checkmate by pushing the rook. So black might want to castle to avoid the checkmate, but then you can push the pawn to checkmate. So in either cases, in the actual chess game with an actual game history, you can always mate in 2. But the problem is, this is a retrograde chess puzzle where the actual history of the game is unknown. If you consider the rules, if you try to push the king, then black will castle. Because castling is allowed from the rules, you don't know the history, so you cannot say black is not allowed to castle. And if you do en passant, then black will do anything except castling. If black does not castle, then you cannot prove your en passant was valid. That means you violated the rule and failed to solve the puzzle. So this puzzle can be solved in actual chess game with an actual given history, but under the retrograde chess rules, this puzzle remains unsolvable, which means the retrograde chess rule is defective in some cases. We call this a partial retrograde analysis. When a contradiction happens in the rule set, you ignore the retrograde chess rules, look for all possible game histories, and solve the puzzle for each case. Next, I will show you another very interesting example. White to move, mate in 2. The most favored move looks like to be rook h f1. Then even the king tries to escape, rook f8 and checkmate. This seems easy, unless black castles. You know, it is possible because of the rule. The player is allowed to castle. So now it seems like you cannot mate in 2. Is that so? Of course not. At this moment, you may have noticed something, that is, you can also castle. Of course you can castle, the rule says you can, but the problem is it doesn't change anything. Black can castle and nothing is different. But that's not true. There is a huge difference between simply moving the rook and the castle. Let me explain why. If you castle, that means your king and the rook stayed stationary in this game. Therefore, your queen's rook have been trapped and died somewhere around their hometown. That means the third rook on f3 is actually a promoted pawn. Now we ask, where would the promotion take place? If the third rook had been made on one of these squares, the rook couldn't escape unless black king or the rook has moved. If the third rook has been made on one of these squares, the rook seems to be able to escape, but the rook should have checked the king during the escape. And black has no way to avoid this check unless he takes the rook or move his king. Obviously, black didn't capture the rook, so the king had to move and this breaks the ability to castle. So in either cases, either the black king or the rook has moved. That means if you castle, then black cannot castle, and you can force the checkmate. This is called the retro strategy. You exploit the rule of the retrograde chess puzzle to logically disturb the opponent's move. Lastly, let me introduce the super complicated one, the time paradox. In this example, black just moved the pawn, but which one is unknown. Now, if you think carefully, if you can castle, then you can actually prove that you can also do en passant. In this case, you just do the en passant. It's technically violating the rule at this moment, but remember, we are working on the time paradox. So during the puzzle, you castle. And that means your king and your rook has not moved during the game. By a series of some complicated logical deductions, you can prove that your opponent's last move was pawn 7a5, and that makes your en passant valid. This is called a posteriori. This is a Latin word meaning from the latter. You do the illegal en passant first, violating the rule at this moment, then prove it was actually legal by castling later on the game. And you know what? This example, this exact position, was created by myself back in 2021. But explaining the logic behind this is too complicated for now, so I'll talk about this puzzle in the next video. Thank you for watching, have a great day!